Horror story. I was 15 when I first heard the story about the forest. It had always been there, a hulking mass of twisted trees and thick underbrush just beyond my grandmother's house. Its dense canopy stretched across the horizon like a barrier separating us from something ancient, something dark. The older I got, the more I noticed the way people talked about it in whispers, as if even speaking its name might summon something from its depths. My grandmother had lived near that forest all her life. She was a tough woman, hardened by years of living alone after my grandfather passed. She always carried a quiet kind of strength, but the one thing that seemed to unnerve her was that forest. She would catch me glancing toward the tree line from her porch and would quickly pull me inside, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. One afternoon, as we sat together by the fireplace, the topic of the forest finally came up. I had been dying to ask her about it, but the words had always caught in my throat, like some unspoken rule forbade it. But that day was different. Maybe it was the storm brewing outside, the way the wind howled through the trees, or the way the fire seemed dimmer than usual. Whatever it was, I felt the courage to ask. "Grandma," I began hesitantly, "why does everyone avoid the forest?" She didn't answer at first, just stared into the flickering flames. The silence stretched on, and I almost regretted bringing it up when she finally spoke, her voice low and deliberate, like she was choosing each word carefully. "That forest wasn't always like this," she said, her eyes not leaving the fire. "There was a time before the war when people would wander through it without a second thought. But that was before they started disappearing." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Disappearing? What do you mean?" She sighed heavily, as if the weight of the memories was pressing down on her. "During the Second World War, the forest became a place of refuge for those trying to escape the horrors of conflict. People would run into its depths, believing the trees would hide them, protect them. But most of them, they never came out." I shuddered as her words painted a grim picture. "What happened to them?" Her gaze finally shifted to me, her eyes darker than I had ever seen them. "No one knows for sure. Some say they were caught by enemy soldiers, but others believe something else was at work in that forest. Something older than the war." I wanted to laugh it off, to brush aside the creeping unease her words brought with them, but the look on her face stopped me. This was no bedtime story. This was something that had haunted her for decades. "After the war ended," she continued, "people stopped going into the forest. They said it had changed, that it had become hungry. The trees grew thicker, the paths overgrown, and those who ventured too deep would hear strange things. Whispers, footsteps behind them, shadows that didn't belong. And then there were the disappearances. Not many, not enough to cause a stir, but enough that the villagers knew something wasn't right." I glanced toward the window, the storm outside raging harder now, its wind screaming against the house. The forest loomed just beyond, its silhouette barely visible in the darkening sky. "They tried to blame it on wild animals, or the disorientation of being lost," she said. "But I've heard the stories from people I trust. There's something alive in that forest, something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't know what to say. A part of me didn't want to believe her, but another part, the part that had always felt a strange pull toward the forest, was terrified that she was right. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent my mind racing. My grandmother's words echoed in my head, refusing to let go. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but this was different. It was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. It sounded like words. Faint, disjointed, as if carried by a voice just out of reach. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small gap in the curtains where the moonlight bled through. I strained to listen, hoping, praying, that it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again. Clearer this time. It came from the direction of the window, from the forest. I threw off the blankets and crept toward the window, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Slowly I pulled back the curtain and my breath caught in my throat. The forest was alive. The trees swayed unnaturally as if something was moving between them, something large. Shadows flickered at the edge of the clearing, shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. But it was the whispers that truly terrified me. They were louder now, urgent, like a chorus of voices trying to tell me something. They were calling me. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The wind died, the shadows stilled, and the forest was silent once more. But I knew something had changed. Something had awakened in the darkness, and it had seen me. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told my grandmother about the whispers, about what I had seen, but she just nodded grimly as if she had been expecting it. "You've heard it now," she said quietly. "You've caught its attention. Be careful, child. Once the forest knows you're there, it doesn't let go. Her words haunted me for days after. I tried to avoid looking at the forest, but it was always there, looming just at the edge of my vision. And the whispers, they hadn't stopped. Even when I wasn't near the forest, I could hear them sometimes, faint and distant, like a memory I couldn't shake. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. The forest had woken up, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. It was a week after that night, after the whispers first found me, that the storm came. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sky darken, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel path. It was my friend Ben. He and I had grown up together, spending long summers exploring the countryside, but we had never ventured into the forest. Not really. Not after all the warnings from my grandmother and the quiet superstition that gripped our small town. Ben plopped down next to me, his face flushed from the humid air. "Looks like a storm's rolling in," he said, squinting at the horizon. "Big one too." I nodded, feeling a familiar unease twist in my stomach. The sky had turned a deep, angry shade of gray, thick clouds boiling overhead. It wasn't the usual kind of storm. There was something wrong about it, something heavy and oppressive, like the sky itself was about to crack open and spill something darker than rain. As we sat there, I noticed the clouds were gathering over the forest. Not just above it, but focused there, swirling and spiraling like a vortex directly above the treetops. I had never seen anything like it. The wind picked up, howling as if trying to pull the forest apart, but the trees stood firm, unmoving despite the storm's fury. Then the lightning began. It struck the forest with a violence I had never witnessed. Bolts of blinding white light ripped through the sky, crashing into the trees one after another. Each strike was followed by a deafening crack that echoed across the valley. The forest seemed to shudder beneath the onslaught, the shadows between the trees deepening, twisting. Ben and I exchanged a glance. There was no way to ignore it. The storm was calling to us, pulling at some buried curiosity. We had heard the stories all our lives, the warnings, but something about the raw, primal power of the storm made it impossible to resist. "We have to check it out," Ben said, standing up. His voice was shaky, but there was excitement in his eyes. "That's not normal. I've never seen anything like that." I hesitated. The memory of the whispers still haunted me, but Ben was already halfway down the porch steps, his excitement contagious. I got up, my pulse quickening. Every part of me screamed to stay back, to stay safe, but I followed him. Maybe it was the pull of the storm. Maybe it was the forest itself, reaching out, beckoning. We grabbed our jackets and took off, running toward the treeline. The air grew thick with moisture as we approached, the smell of ozone sharp in the air. Fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering the ground, but neither of us stopped. The trees loomed larger as we got closer, and soon we were standing at the edge of the forest, drenched but breathless, staring into the dark maw that awaited us. The lightning struck again, closer this time, lighting up the forest in blinding flashes. In those brief moments of clarity, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, something too large and too fast to be an animal. But before I could say anything, the sky opened up, and the rain began to pour in earnest. It was a downpour, heavy and relentless, the kind that turns the ground to mud and blinds you with sheets of water. "Let's go," Ben shouted over the roar of the rain, and before I could protest, he plunged into the forest. I followed, my heart racing. The moment we crossed the threshold, the world changed. The rain was colder in the forest. The trees above seemed to block most of it, but what did fall was icy, piercing through my soaked clothes. I could barely see a few feet ahead, the storm clouds above swirling like a thick, dark blanket, choking out any remaining daylight. It was the fog that sealed our fate. One moment we were running through the trees, our shoes sloshing through wet leaves and mud, and the next, everything was swallowed by a thick, unnatural fog. It rolled in so fast, so dense, that it felt like a living thing wrapping itself around us. Within seconds, the world outside the fog vanished. The trees, the path, the storm itself, all of it disappeared, leaving Ben and me trapped in a cold, damp void. "I can't see a thing," Ben shouted, his voice muffled by the fog. I could barely make out his shape just a few feet ahead of me, a shadow lost in the swirling mist. "Ben, wait," I called, but my voice seemed to vanish into the fog as well, swallowed whole by the oppressive silence that had settled over us. I ran toward where I had last seen him, but with every step, the ground seemed to shift beneath me. The trees, once familiar, now twisted into unfamiliar shapes, and the air grew colder, the rain turning into an icy mist that clung to my skin. My breathing quickened, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached out, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to, but all I felt was the cold, damp air slipping through my fingers. "Ben?" I called again, panic rising in my throat. No answer. My foot caught on something, maybe a root, and I stumbled forward, hitting the ground hard. The fog was so thick now that even the ground beneath me seemed to dissolve into it. I pushed myself up, my hands sinking into the wet earth, and tried to find my bearings. But there was nothing. No landmarks, no paths. Just an endless sea of gray mist. I was lost. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe the rain, but it was neither. It was soft, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. A whisper just like the one I had heard in my room. It was coming from deeper in the fog. I froze, my skin prickling with fear. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind. Once the forest knows you're there, it doesn't let go. The whisper grew louder, closer, though I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like a dozen voices, overlapping, their words tangled and frantic. I tried to move, to get away, but my body felt heavy, as though the fog itself was holding me in place. I called out for Ben again, but my voice was swallowed by the mist. I could hear movement now, soft footsteps crunching through the wet undergrowth, circling me, getting closer. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm. I screamed, spinning around, only to find Ben standing there, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving as if he'd been running. "We need to get out of here," he panted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Together we started moving, but no matter which direction we turned, the fog thickened, the trees around us closing in like prison bars. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent, as though the forest itself was angry that we had entered its domain. My heart pounded in my chest as we stumbled through the dense fog, disoriented and lost. Every tree looked the same, every path a dead end. Then the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It pressed down on us, suffocating, as if the air itself had turned against us. I reached for Ben's arm again, but my hand grasped empty air. He was gone. "Ben?" I called, my voice trembling. But the forest remained silent. No one ever saw us after that.